The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. But what happens when something defies every sensor, every theory, every rational explanation? Captain Jean-Luc Picard had faced the Q continuum, temporal anomalies, and threats that bent the very fabric of reality. Yet nothing quite prepared him for the moment when his science officer's voice cracked with barely contained confusion. "Captain, we're reading an unprecedented subspace distortion near the archaeological site," Lieutenant Commander Data reported from his station on the bridge of the USS Enterprise D, his yellow eyes narrowing as cascading data scrolled across his screen. "The energy signature is inconsistent with any known phenomenon. Electromagnetic, temporal, and what appears to be organic signatures simultaneously occupying the same space." It was stardate 47392. 3 weeks after the Enterprise had arrived at Sigma Draconis 4 to investigate the ruins of an ancient civilization known to Federation xenoarchaeologists only through fragmentary records. The away team, led by Commander Riker, had been cataloging a crystalline structure in the planet's largest archaeological site, something the preliminary scan suggested was either a weapon or a beacon, though its true purpose remained elusive. "Yellow alert," Picard commanded, his tone measured but carrying the weight of command. Around him, the bridge of his starship hummed with the quiet intensity of a crew recognizing danger. "All hands, stand by. Lieutenant Worf, raise shields to full." "Mr. Data, can you characterize the distortion?" "Affirmative, sir. The phenomenon appears to be a dimensional rupture, similar in signature to the spatial anomalies encountered near the Badlands, but significantly more unstable. The energy output is increasing exponentially." Data's fingers moved across his console with mechanical precision. "Captain, I am detecting 3 distinct chronoton signatures. And what appears to be biological matter undergoing atomic-level destabilization." Before Picard could respond, alarms shrieked across the bridge. Red warning lights bathed the command center in urgent crimson, casting sharp shadows across the faces of his crew. The starship trembled, a subtle vibration that spoke of forces beyond Federation understanding pressing against the Enterprise's structural integrity. "All decks report." Worf's Klingon baritone cut through the chaos, his warrior instincts already assessing tactical threats. The transporter chief's voice crackled through the comm system. "Captain, we've got an uncontrolled energy discharge near the transporter array on Deck 7. It's not matching any known transport signature. The pattern is unstable." The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then stabilized. In the transporter room on Deck 7, Chief O'Brien had barely had time to evacuate non-essential personnel before the phenomenon manifested. The transporter pad, a station designed to disassemble and reassemble the molecular structure of living beings across vast distances, erupted in a column of incandescent light. The energy wasn't consistent with any transporter cascade. It writhed and twisted, as if reality itself was struggling to accommodate something it was never designed to contain. And then, silence. The light faded. The alarms quieted to a steady yellow alert. Chief O'Brien cautiously approached the transporter pad, his hand hovering near the emergency shutdown, his eyes narrowed with professional concern. A figure stood on the pad. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with pale skin that seemed almost luminescent in the harsh transporter room light. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and his clothing was archaic. A long, dark coat that had seen centuries of wear, tattered at the edges, adorned with intricate embroidery that suggested a craft lost to modern civilization. His eyes were the most striking feature, deep crimson, with a predatory intelligence that made O'Brien's hand instinctively move toward his phaser. The figure's gaze swept the transporter room with the methodical assessment of a warrior evaluating a battlefield. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured, carrying an accent that belonged to no known Federation culture. "Where am I? This is not the realm I was summoned to protect." Before O'Brien could respond, before he could even draw his weapon, The transporter room doors hissed open and security personnel rushed in, phasers raised. The figure didn't move. He simply turned his head slightly, regarding them with an expression of profound weariness, as if he had faced this scenario countless times across the centuries of his existence. "Stand down," O'Brien commanded, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "Nobody fire. We don't know what we're dealing with yet." On the bridge, Picard received the report with the calm demeanor of a captain who had learned that panic solved nothing. "Mr. Data, can you get a transporter lock on that entity? Containment procedures, standard level 1. I am attempting, sir, but the biological signature is unlike anything in our databases. The molecular structure appears to be partially incorporeal. He is solid, but his matter density fluctuates at a subatomic level." Data's tone suggested deep fascination mixed with scientific consternation. "Additionally, Captain, I am reading trace amounts of what appears to be supernatural energy signatures. This is impossible according to established Federation science." Picard leaned forward in his command chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, a gesture Riker had learned long ago meant his captain was thinking several moves ahead. "Bring him to the conference room. Maximum security. If he moves against us, I want every shield and weapon ready." Minutes later, Alucard, though his name meant nothing to the crew that escorted him through the corridors of the Enterprise D, found himself in a sleek, modern conference room with a panoramic viewport revealing the curve of Sigma Draconis 4 below. He sat at a long table of seamless Federation design, his pale hands folded before him with the patience of someone who had waited centuries for moments of significance. Captain Picard entered with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, flanked by Counselor Deanna Troi and Chief of Security Worf. Data stood near the doorway, his positronic mind processing every detail of their guest's appearance and demeanor. "I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise," the captain began, his tone diplomatic but firm. "You appeared on our vessel without authorization. I need to know, what is your name, your origin, and your purpose here?" Alucard's crimson eyes met Picard's with a directness that suggested he recognized authority when he encountered it. "I am Alucard," he said, the name itself seeming to carry weight across centuries. "I was bound by purpose, duty, to protect your artifact." He gestured vaguely, as if pointing to something beyond the walls of the starship. "It called to me. I responded as I have responded for generations. But this." He looked around the conference room, at the technology and the uniforms and the rational precision of Federation design. "This is not my realm." Counselor Troi leaned forward, her empathic senses reaching toward the figure across the table. What she felt was a storm of emotions, ancient sorrow, determination, exhaustion, and something deeper, a profound isolation that had accumulated across centuries of immortal existence. "You were summoned by an artifact on the planet below?" Picard asked, his mind already working through the implications. "The archaeological site our away team was investigating. It resonated with a power I recognize," Alucard replied. "A call to duty. A summoning of purpose. I came as I always come when the darkness threatens." Worf's hand moved subtly toward his phaser. "Captain. This entity claims to be immortal and to possess powers beyond Federation understanding. Given the security risk." "Stand easy, Mr. Worf," Picard said, raising a hand. He studied Alucard with the gaze of a captain who had learned that understanding often preceded safety. "Mr. Data, what can you tell us about his physiology?" "The analysis is ongoing, sir, but preliminary findings are extraordinary. His cellular structure exhibits regenerative properties far exceeding any known species. Additionally, there are energy signatures that do not correspond to conventional biology. If I may be direct, it appears that, Captain, we are in the presence of something that should not exist according to our understanding of science." Picard nodded slowly, then met Alucard's gaze once more. "You said you came to protect against darkness. Tell me, Alucard, in this galaxy, what is darkness to you? The vampire's crimson eyes seemed to look through the captain, piercing the veil between present and past. Darkness takes many forms across the ages. Evil wears different masks. Here, in this realm of light and reason, I suspect darkness wears a mask you have not yet recognized. The words hung in the conference room like a prophecy, and Captain Picard felt the weight of command settle more heavily upon his shoulders. Then perhaps, Picard said, his fingers steepling once more, we have much to discuss. The Enterprise hung in standard orbit above Sigma Draconis 4, its running lights reflecting off the dark waters of the night side of the planet. Inside the captain's ready room, Picard reviewed the preliminary archaeological data while nursing a cup of Earl Grey tea, a ritual that had grounded him through countless diplomatic crises, temporal anomalies, and first contact scenarios. But nothing in his decades of Starfleet service had prepared him for the being currently confined to quarters on Deck 9 with a security detail standing watch outside. Counselor Troi had spent the last 4 hours in conversation with Alucard, her empathic abilities providing a window into a consciousness that science could not quantify. What she had reported was troubling, genuine conviction, no deception, and a sadness so profound it had nearly overwhelmed her telepathic senses. He truly believed himself to be what he claimed, an immortal protector, bound by duty across centuries, caught between worlds and purposes. He's not hostile, Captain, Troi had said in her briefing. But he's also not entirely present in this moment. Part of his consciousness remains, elsewhere. Watching for threats we can't see. It's as if he's always partially in another reality, another layer of existence. Data had continued his analysis throughout the ship cycle. The android had processed terabytes of biological data, cross-referenced it against every xenological database in Federation records, and reached conclusions that contradicted fundamental assumptions about the nature of life itself. Captain, data reported via combadge, I have completed the preliminary biomolecular analysis. Alucard's physiology suggests he is not naturally evolved within this universe's parameters. His cellular structure contains what I can only describe as shadow matter. A substance that occupies quantum states between conventional matter and energy. Furthermore, his regenerative capabilities appear limited only by the availability of biological material. If the archaeological records are accurate regarding his origin point, he has been alive for approximately 573 years. Picard set down his tea. 5 centuries. Not the theoretical immortality of a species with exceptional longevity, but genuine, continuous consciousness spanning more than half a millennium. The philosophical implications alone were staggering. What did mortality mean to a being who had watched empires rise and fall? What did the Prime Directive mean to someone for whom the lives of civilizations were footnotes? The comm chimed. Bridge to Captain Picard, Riker's voice came through. We've received an update from the away team on Sigma Draconis 4. Dr. Voss wants to report on the artifact. It's unusual, sir. Picard here. Put her on. Dar. Lydia Voss appeared on his personal monitor, her face showing the excited tension of an archaeologist on the verge of a significant discovery. Behind her, the crystalline structure that had summoned Alucard gleamed under portable lighting rigs. Captain, we've begun preliminary analysis of the artifact, Voss said, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness. It's not a weapon. It's not a beacon in any conventional sense. It appears to be a lock. Or rather, the key to a lock. The energy signatures we're detecting suggest it was designed to bridge dimensional barriers. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, nothing in the archaeological record matches its sophistication. Who built it, Doctor? Picard asked. That's the remarkable part, sir. Carbon dating suggests it was constructed approximately 570 years ago. But the civilization we've been studying here, the one that left these ruins, declined over 2,000 years prior. This artifact predates the ruins it's buried within. Picard felt the pieces shifting in his mind, like a three-dimensional chess problem suddenly revealing new layers. Is it possible the artifact was placed here deliberately? Buried in a location it would eventually be discovered? That's exactly what I believe, Captain. And there's more. The crystalline matrix contains inscriptions in a language that doesn't match any known civilization. But there are symbols, warning marks, if I'm interpreting them correctly. They suggest the artifact was a call of distress. A signal to something. Or someone. After the transmission ended, Picard made a decision. He needed more information, and there was only one source available. He ordered Alucard brought to his ready room under guard, with Worf standing by in case the situation escalated. When the vampire entered, he moved with a grace that belied his centuries. His crimson eyes swept across Picard's personal effects, the model of the USS Enterprise D on the shelf, the books on history and philosophy, the evidence of a mind that valued knowledge as much as duty. The artifact on the planet, Picard said without preamble. Tell me about it. How did you know it was a call to you specifically? Alucard settled into a chair with the careful movements of someone accustomed to occupying spaces where his presence was a threat. I recognize the work of those I once knew, he said. The craftsmanship, the resonance, it was created by someone who understood both the darkness I protect against and the means to reach across the void between worlds. It was a beacon designed by someone who understood my nature. Who? Picard leaned forward. Who created it? A woman, Alucard said, and for the first time, genuine emotion flickered across his features, sorrow mixed with something that might have been love. A scholar. A warrior in her own way. She understood that my world was dying, that the darkness I fought was consuming everything I had sworn to protect. She created the artifact to give me one final purpose. To find a realm where darkness still threatened, where a protector might make a difference. Picard processed this information with the methodical precision of a captain trained to evaluate the testimony of potentially unreliable witnesses, though everything about Alucard's bearing suggested he believed every word he spoke. Your world, Picard said carefully. Tell me about it. Alucard's gaze turned toward the viewport, where Sigma Draconis IV rotated below them, peaceful and ancient. A world of gothic spires and eternal night. Of creatures born from darkness itself. Of a war between light and shadow that had no ending, only cycles. I was bound to that realm by destiny and by blood, the blood of my enemy, which I had consumed to gain his power. I was a weapon, Captain. A tool crafted by circumstance and sacrifice to hold back the abyss. And now? Picard asked. Now, Alucard turned back to face him, I am something else. I am in a realm where your science seeks to eliminate darkness through understanding rather than combat. Where you believe conflict can be resolved through negotiation rather than annihilation. It is alien to everything I know. And yet. He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to the concept. Yet it resonates with something deeper. A hope I thought had died centuries ago. Picard recognized the moment for what it was, a being at a crossroads, torn between the only purpose he had ever known and the possibility of something new. It was a vulnerability he could exploit. Or an opportunity to forge an alliance that might change everything. I cannot offer you certainty, Picard said, his voice taking on the diplomatic tones of a captain accustomed to negotiations with alien powers. The Federation operates on principles that may seem weak to you, diplomacy, the prime directive, the belief that all life has inherent value regardless of its threat level. We do not kill easily, and we do not accept tools of violence regardless of their effectiveness. Then why am I here? Alucard asked. Why did your artifact not remain a sensor anomaly detected? And catalogued, then dismissed? Because, Picard replied, the universe has a way of presenting us with challenges that force us to reconsider our principles. And because I believe you are not merely a weapon. I believe you are something more, a being capable of choice, of growth, of finding new purpose beyond mere survival and combat. Alucard's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his ancient eyes, a glimmer of something that might have been recognition. "Very well, Captain Picard," Alucard said. "I will cooperate with your investigation. But understand this, if the darkness I was created to fight has followed me across the dimensional barrier, no principle or regulation will stop me from meeting it. Some evils cannot be negotiated with. Some threats can only be ended by one willing to become darkness themselves." Picard nodded slowly. "Then let us hope it does not come to that." But even as he spoke, alarms began to sound across the Enterprise. On the planet below, sensors detected a massive surge of energy from the archaeological site, and the artifact, the one that had called Alucard across dimensions, had just activated once more. This time, it was not summoning. It was transmitting. And somewhere in the depths of space, something was receiving the signal. The archaeological site erupted into chaos as energy cascaded through the crystalline structure like lightning seeking ground. Dr. Voss and her team scrambled to maintain their equipment, their preliminary readings overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the phenomenon unfolding before them. The artifact wasn't just transmitting, it was transforming, its lattice structure shifting through states of matter that shouldn't have been possible, becoming something between solid and pure energy. "Away team, evacuate the site immediately." Riker's voice crackled through the comm badge with the sharp authority of a first officer who had learned command through hard experience. "Transporter room, lock onto all Federation personnel and initiate emergency beam out." On the Enterprise bridge, every station blazed with alerts. The sensors that Data had struggled to interpret were now going haywire, overwhelmed by readings that contradicted each other. Subspace fluctuations spiked to dangerous levels. Temporal distortions rippled outward from the artifact's transmission point like stones thrown into a quantum pond. "Captain to the bridge." Picard's voice was calm, but the urgency was unmistakable. He moved with the controlled efficiency of a captain who had learned that panic was the enemy of survival. Behind him came Alucard, the vampire's crimson eyes narrowing as if he could perceive something the ship's sensors could not. When Picard reached the bridge, the situation was immediately apparent. The view screen showed the artifact on Sigma Draconis 4, now pulsing with light so bright it saturated the image. Riker had already recalled the away team, all personnel were accounted for and safe aboard the Enterprise. "Status report," Picard commanded, settling into his command chair. "Captain, the artifact's transmission is continuing to escalate," Data reported, his fingers moving across his console with mechanical precision. "Based on the energy signatures, it is broadcasting across multiple subspace frequencies simultaneously. The transmission is powerful enough to reach across several light-years. If I may hypothesize, sir, it appears to be a distress signal, or an invitation." "To whom?" Worf demanded, his hand already resting on the phaser control console. Alucard moved to stand beside the tactical station, his ancient eyes fixed on the view screen with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what was occurring. "To those who hunt me," he said quietly. "To those who followed me across the dimensional barrier." The artifact was not only a beacon to summon me, it was also a lock designed to contain something. When I passed through the dimensional rupture, I disrupted that lock. Now, it is functioning as a key in reverse, opening a doorway for what I left behind. "What exactly did you leave behind?" Picard demanded, his mind already racing through contingencies and tactical scenarios. Before Alucard could respond, the sensors screamed a new alert. Something was emerging from subspace itself, tearing through the dimensional barrier like a predator ripping through flesh. It appeared on the view screen, a massive construct of shadows and twisted matter that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It had no fixed shape, but rather flowed between geometric forms and organic configurations, as if reality could not quite decide what it was looking at. "Unidentified object entering normal space," Worf reported, his Klingon warrior instincts already assessing the threat. "Massive energy signature. It's... I have no tactical classification for this. Weapons are charged and standing by." Hold fire, Picard commanded. We don't yet know if it's hostile. Captain, Data interjected, his tone carrying a note of urgency unusual for an android. The entity's energy signature is increasing. If I may estimate based on the rate of spatial distortion, it will reach our position in approximately 4 minutes. Additionally, the entity is emitting radiation across multiple spectra. Our shields are currently effective against approximately 73% of the energy output. Picard turned to Alucard. What is it? The vampire's jaw tightened, the first genuine display of tension Picard had witnessed from him. A Nosferatu, Alucard said, the word carrying the weight of ancient enmity. One of the progenitors. One of the oldest and most powerful of our kind. It is a creature of pure hunger, Captain. Logic means nothing to it. Negotiation is impossible. It exists only to consume, to dominate, to corrupt everything it touches. One of your kind. Riker's voice came through the comm from engineering, where he had relocated to monitor the starship systems during the crisis. You're telling us there are more of these things? There are many, Alucard replied, and for the first time, his voice carried an emotion that transcended stoic duty, it carried despair. But the Nosferatu are ancient. They are the source from which lesser creatures like myself descended. They are gods of darkness, and this one has hunted me across dimensions and time itself. It will not stop. It cannot be reasoned with or contained by your conventional means. Picard's mind worked through the situation with the precision of a captain who had faced threats that defied conventional classification. The entity was approaching rapidly. Direct combat would be tactically disadvantageous given the unknown nature of its capabilities. Yet evacuation was impossible, there was nowhere to evacuate to that would escape an entity capable of crossing dimensional barriers. Mr. Data, what would happen if we activated the ship's deflector shields to full capacity? The shields would remain effective against the entity's known energy signatures for approximately 12 minutes, sir. However, the power drain on our systems would be severe. All non-essential systems would be taken offline. Our warp core would be operating at maximum capacity. If the entity develops additional attack vectors or discovers the frequency of our shield harmonics, our defenses could fail catastrophically. Evasive maneuvers, Picard said. Maximum impulse power. Take us around the planet. Use Sigma Draconis 4 as a gravitational obstacle. Buy us time. The Enterprise lurched as it came about, the inertial dampeners struggling to compensate for the sudden acceleration. On the view screen, the Nosferatu followed with inhuman swiftness, defying the laws of physics that should have governed its movement. It was as if space itself was bending to accommodate its passage. Captain, Worf growled, his warrior's instinct screaming for direct combat, we should take the fight to it. Our weapons will be ineffective against something that cannot be killed by conventional means, Picard interrupted. He turned to Alucard. You said you were created to fight creatures like this. Can you fight it? Alucard's expression hardened into something ancient and terrible. Yes, he said simply. But to do so, I must become what I have always feared, the very darkness I was meant to contain. Explain, Picard commanded. My power is not limited, Alucard said, his crimson eyes burning with an intensity that made even the hardened officers on the bridge uncomfortable. I can command shadow itself. I can take forms that exist partially outside normal spacetime. But every time I use such abilities, I risk losing the humanity that binds me to duty and morality. I become the monster rather than the protector against monsters. It was a dilemma that Picard understood with the clarity of a man who had faced similar philosophical crises. The choice between principles and survival. The cost of compromise against absolute necessity. Can you fight it without risking the ship? Picard asked. If you can draw it away from the Enterprise and into open space, Alucard replied, I can engage it. Whether I can defeat it, that depends on factors beyond my control. But I will not allow it to consume this vessel or its crew. Picard made his decision in the span of a heartbeat. Prepare a shuttlecraft. Transport Alucard to a safe distance from the ship. We'll use the Enterprise as bait to draw the entity away from populated areas of the sector. Captain. Worf's protest was immediate. That is tactically unsound. The entity will simply pursue us rather than. The entity is hunting Alucard, Picard replied calmly. It will follow him. Mr. Worf, begin launching probes along our course to record the engagement. I want full sensor coverage. And get me subspace contact with Starbase 515. We may need reinforcements or evacuation protocols depending on how this develops. As the Enterprise accelerated toward open space, a shuttlecraft detached from the starship and began moving toward a position ahead of the pursuing entity. Alucard sat in the pilot's seat, his ancient hands gripping controls designed by a civilization that had never imagined his existence. Through the viewport, he could see the Nosferatu descending toward him like a falling star made of shadow. He had fought this battle countless times across 5 centuries. He had lost more times than he could count. But he had never fought it in a realm like this. A universe where the laws of physics were different, where science itself might prove to be a weapon he could turn to his advantage. The shuttle's sensors indicated the entity was close. Dangerously close. Alucard reached out and felt the shadows around him, ready to emerge from the quantum darkness into this new reality. He felt his power coalescing, the darkness within him responding to the call of combat. As the Nosferatu descended, Alucard whispered a prayer in a language dead for 3 centuries, a prayer to a god he no longer believed in, asking only for the strength to protect those who had shown him something he thought he had lost, a reason to fight that was not born of despair. The shuttle's shields flared as the entity made contact. And Alucard, the eternal protector, became something far more dangerous than any Starfleet weapon. The dimensional barrier between life and death, between matter and shadow, became a battlefield as Alucard unleashed his power in ways he had suppressed for decades. The shuttle's interior transformed into a nexus of conflicting forces. Reality itself seemed to bend and warp as the vampire's abilities manifested. Shadows deepened impossibly, spreading across the walls like living things, while simultaneously the shuttle's interior lighting systems flickered between brilliant illumination and absolute darkness. On the Enterprise bridge, Data struggled to maintain sensor locks on the engagement. The readings were contradictory and impossible. The Nosferatu occupied multiple quantum states simultaneously, existing partially in normal space and partially in subspace. Alucard's signature was similarly fractured, his biology shifting between corporeal and incorporeal states at a rate that no traditional sensor array could track. The entity is attempting to breach the shuttle's hull, Data reported, his tone reflecting the scientific fascination and alarm of an android witnessing phenomena that contradicted fundamental physics. However, Alucard is generating a counterforce. Captain, the energy output is equivalent to a Starship-grade warp core operating at full capacity, but concentrated in a space the size of a shuttlecraft. Through the view screen, the distant space around the shuttle erupted into visible light, not the white-hot brilliance of matter-antimatter reactions, but a sickly red luminescence mixed with absolute black, as if the visible spectrum itself was being perverted by the conflict occurring within. Waves of distortion propagated outward like concentric circles in a pond, visible even to the naked eye. Distance to the entity? Picard asked, his mind calculating trajectories and energy expenditures. Widening, sir, Worf reported. The combatants are moving deeper into open space, away from all populated areas. Current vector will take them clear of the Sigma Draconis system within minutes. Maintain our course, Picard commanded. Full power to shields and structural integrity fields. And get me a status update on Alucard's condition. I am attempting to establish a subspace link with the shuttlecraft, Data replied. However, the entity's presence is severely disrupting all communications bands. I can detect biological telemetry from Alucard's implanted comm badge, sir. His heart rate is accelerated to approximately 240 beats per minute. Adrenaline equivalents are flooding his system. He is operating at peak capacity. What the sensors could not reveal was the profound struggle occurring within Alucard's consciousness. The vampire had summoned the disciplines of centuries of combat training, calling upon power that existed at the intersection of matter and antimatter, of light and shadow. His body had partially shifted into a state that was neither fully corporeal nor fully spectral, a form he could maintain only through constant concentration and willpower. The Nosferatu attacked with the mindless ferocity of a creature that knew only hunger and consumption. It was old beyond measure, ancient when Alucard was merely a mortal man with a name now lost to history. It had fed on civilizations and dimensions, its appetite endless, its methods terrible beyond description. But it was also direct in its violence, relying on raw power and the seductive darkness it radiated. Alucard parried and countered with precision honed through 500 years of warfare. Each movement was economical, designed not to waste energy in a contest where stamina was measured not in minutes but in hours. He knew, had always known, that this creature could not be killed by conventional means. Death was not a threat to something that had transcended mortality itself. But in this universe, with its different laws and different possibilities, perhaps there was another way. The shuttle around him became irrelevant. Alucard ejected himself into open space, his form shifting into something that existed partially in the vacuum, sustained by the supernatural energies that comprised his existence. The Nosferatu followed, and they began a dance that defied description, two creatures of shadow and power moving through the darkness between stars. On the Enterprise, the crew watched as the distant conflict continued to escalate. Riker appeared on the bridge via comm, his voice tight with concern. "Captain, the entity's energy signature is increasing. It's consuming something, I'm reading massive power draws from the surrounding space. It's almost like it's feeding on the vacuum itself." "It is," Data confirmed, having completed his analysis. "The entity is tapping into quantum fluctuations in the subspace field. It is, in essence, drawing sustenance from the universe itself. This could allow it to sustain combat indefinitely, or at least for durations far exceeding Alucard's biological capacity." Picard leaned forward in his chair, his mind already working through the problem. "Counselor, you made contact with Alucard's emotional state earlier. Can you reach him now? Can you establish a psychic link?" Counselor Troy closed her eyes, her empathic abilities extending outward like invisible tendrils, searching for the consciousness she had touched earlier. She found him, a presence like a burning star in the darkness, ancient and weary but burning with fierce determination. "I have contact," she said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining the link across such distance. "Captain, he's struggling. The entity is more powerful than he anticipated. He says he's holding it at bay, but he can't defeat it through conventional combat. He's asking for something he calls a conceptual advantage." "What does that mean?" Picard demanded. "He's not entirely clear," Troy replied, her connection wavering slightly. "But I sense something, he's not trying to kill it. He's trying to imprison it. To contain it the way it was contained before. He says the artifact on the planet wasn't just a summons. It was part of a binding ritual. He needs." She trailed off, her concentration breaking momentarily as a surge of emotion flooded through the link, not fear, but something deeper, the ancient sorrow of a being who had spent centuries holding back the darkness, knowing that someday his strength might fail. "He needs the artifact," Troy continued. "He needs to recreate the binding. But he can't do it alone. He needs someone to operate it from the planet. Someone who understands the mathematics of dimensional mechanics." Picard turned to Data. "Can you operate an artifact you don't fully understand?" "Negative, sir," the android replied. "However, I can hypothesize operational parameters based on the energy signatures we've recorded." If I had sufficient data and sufficient time, I estimate I could achieve functional operation with approximately 72% confidence. However, the time available is limited. Alucard can sustain his containment efforts for perhaps another 8 to 12 minutes before fatigue compromises his ability to maintain the binding matrix. Then you have 8 to 12 minutes to get down to that artifact and figure out how to operate it, Picard said, rising from his command chair. Take a full-away team. Science, engineering, security, whatever you need. Go. Data was already moving toward the turbolift. Aye, sir. I will require Dr. Voss to provide contextual information regarding the artifact's construction. And I will need Chief O'Brien in engineering to coordinate with our transporters. The margin for error is minimal. As Data and his team prepared for emergency transport, Picard returned his attention to the ongoing battle. On the view screen, the distant conflict had become almost abstract. Bursts of light and darkness, waves of distortion propagating through space like ripples in reality itself. The Nosferatu was pressing harder now, and he could sense through Counselor Troy's link that Alucard was beginning to tire. How long? Picard asked quietly. 7 minutes, Troy replied, her empathic connection providing real-time assessment. Maybe less. He's beginning to lose coherence. The effort of maintaining a state of being that exists partially outside normal spacetime is consuming tremendous energy. Captain, if we don't succeed in time. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Picard understood the calculus of the situation. If Alucard fell, the Nosferatu would be free to consume the Enterprise and everything in this sector. The creature had already demonstrated the ability to cross dimensional barriers. There was no telling what it might accomplish if unleashed in Federation space. But more than that, Picard found himself genuinely concerned for the ancient vampire who had appeared on his ship mere hours ago. Whatever Alucard was, whatever he had done and whatever darkness he contained, he was fighting with everything he possessed to protect people he had only just met, in a universe that was utterly alien to him. That was enough. All hands, this is the captain, Picard said, his voice carrying the authority and conviction of a man who had learned to lead through example. We have a team on the surface attempting to contain an entity that defies conventional understanding. Until that containment is achieved, we maintain position and provide all support possible. There will be no evacuation, no abandonment of this post. We stand firm. Picard out. On Sigma Draconis 4, Data and his team materialized near the artifact, which had ceased its transmission but continued to pulse with faint luminescence. The ancient crystalline structure seemed to hum with purpose, as if waiting for someone to understand its secrets. Dar. Voss, Data said, his optical sensors already scanning the artifact at multiple wavelengths, I require every piece of information you have regarding this structure's construction and purpose. Quickly. The inscriptions, Voss replied, moving to the artifact's central column. They describe something called the Binding of Shadows. A ritual designed to trap something malevolent in a state of quantum suspension. But the mathematics are unlike anything in our archaeological records. It's almost like they're describing a form of dimensional calculus that predates modern physics. Data's positronic brain processed the information in milliseconds. Show me, he commanded. Show me everything. In open space, Alucard felt his strength beginning to wane. The Nosferatu sensed weakness as predators always do, pressing harder, pushing deeper into the supernatural defenses the vampire maintained. And yet Alucard held, drawing on reserves that most beings would have depleted long ago. He thought of Captain Picard's words. That choice and purpose could be found even in an alien universe. He thought of Counselor Troy's empathic presence, linking him to this new realm. He thought of Data's logical determination, and Worf's quiet honor, and Riker's fierce protection of his crew. He thought of the possibility that his long existence might finally mean something more than merely holding back the darkness. And he held. The artifact pulsed beneath Data's hands as the android interfaced directly with its crystalline matrix, using a specialized isolinear chip to establish a compatible connection. The mathematics were indeed alien, not to Data's processing capabilities, which could handle any computational problem, but to the very foundations of Federation physics. This was a system designed by a mind that thought in dimensions humans had no names for, calculated using principles that treated space and time as malleable variables rather than fixed constants. Dr. Voss, the inscriptions on the northern face, Data said, his voice taking on the rapid-fire precision of an android operating at maximum processing speed. They describe energy phase shifts. Specific frequencies that must be harmonized with the dimensional aperture. If I'm interpreting correctly, the artifact doesn't contain the entity, it creates a pocket of subspace that exists adjacent to normal reality. A prison made of folded space itself. Can you activate it? Voss asked, her archaeological training suddenly proving inadequate to the crisis at hand. She was accustomed to interpreting artifacts from dead civilizations, not operating them in circumstances where failure meant the death of everyone she knew. Affirmative, Data replied. However, the activation sequence requires precise calibration. A margin of error exceeding 0.3% will result in catastrophic failure. The dimensional pocket will collapse, likely with catastrophic consequences for subspace stability in this sector. Additionally, the binding process requires continuous power input. The artifact must remain active indefinitely, or the entity will eventually break free. On the Enterprise bridge, Counselor Troy's connection to Alucard was becoming increasingly strained. The vampire's consciousness was like a star burning through its fuel, brilliant and fierce but inevitably approaching exhaustion. 5 minutes, she reported, her voice shaking slightly. He's losing coherence. The entity is adapting to his attack patterns. It's learning. Captain, I don't know how much longer he can hold. Picard's hands gripped the armrests of his command chair with white-knuckled intensity. He was a captain trained in the traditions of Starfleet, an organization founded on the principle that there was always a logical solution, always a way to preserve life, always a path that didn't require sacrifice. But the universe, he had learned across decades of command, had little patience for ideology when confronted with existential necessity. Mr. Worf, Picard said quietly, if we lose Alucard and the artifact fails to contain that entity, what is our tactical assessment? The Klingon's jaw tightened. The entity would likely pursue us, Captain. Our shields would be effective for approximately 12 to 14 minutes. After that, structural failure is probable. Evacuation would be possible, but the starship would be lost. How many lives aboard this vessel? 1,217, sir. Picard nodded slowly. Over 1,000 people. Families, officers, civilians. The weight of that responsibility settled across his shoulders like the gravity of a collapsing star. This was the mathematics of command, lives weighed against principles, duty against compassion. Then we will not lose, Picard said simply. On the planet's surface, Data's fingers moved across a holographic interface that had materialized before him, showing the artifact's internal configuration in three-dimensional mathematical space. Each parameter he adjusted sent subtle resonances through the crystalline structure, fine-tuning the dimensional harmonics. 70% calibration, Data reported to the Enterprise. The binding matrix is stabilizing. 80%. However, Captain, I must inform you of a significant problem. The artifact was designed to be powered by a specific energy source. Source, something the original creators called the essence of the Protector. I believe this refers to Alucard himself. Picard felt the implication hit like a physical blow. Explain. The binding ritual requires a conscious entity of sufficient power to anchor the dimensional pocket, Data continued, his voice carrying the clinical precision of an android delivering unwelcome facts. The artifact alone cannot sustain the prison. It requires active participation. If Alucard is to contain the Nosferatu permanently, he would need to remain connected to the artifact indefinitely, serving as a living anchor for the binding. In essence, he would become part of the prison itself. In open space, Alucard felt the moment when understanding crystallized in his ancient consciousness. He had somehow always known this would be the cost. Containment was never complete without sacrifice. The darkness could not be merely defeated. It could only be held at bay, and holding it required a will strong enough to never break, a consciousness eternal enough to endure the weight. He had spent 500 years protecting a world that was dying. He had watched empires crumble and heroes fall. He had become something less than alive and more than dead, existing in the liminal space between human and monster. And now, in a universe he had only just discovered, he would spend eternity in a role more true to his nature than any he had played before. But there was a choice here, something that had eluded him across his entire existence. For the first time, he was not compelled by destiny or bound by blood magic. He could choose to let the Nosferatu consume this ship, this crew, this newly discovered realm. He could release his hold and let darkness have its triumph. No one would blame him. He had already given more than any being should. Through Counselor Troy's empathic link, Picard sensed the moment of hesitation. He sensed Alucard's profound weariness, the accumulated sorrow of centuries of struggle. And he understood that this ancient being, this protector forged in darkness, was considering surrender. Alucard, Picard said, his voice cutting through the subspace link with all the force of his command presence, I cannot ask you to do this. No captain should ask a being to sacrifice their freedom for a crew they have only just met. But I am asking. Not as a commander, but as a man who has learned that the measure of a being is not their power, but their choice. Choose, Alucard. Choose whether the darkness wins or whether we stand together. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Alucard's presence in the link solidified, became more focused and present. Picard sensed something shift in the ancient consciousness, not despair, but acceptance. Not resignation, but purpose finally understood. 90% calibration, data reported. The binding matrix is nearly ready. Alucard, I am detecting a change in your energy signature. You are moving toward the artifact's coordinates. Your intent appears to be to complete the binding. Alucard's voice came through the communications channel, surprisingly calm given the circumstances. To become the anchor that holds this creature in its dimensional prison. This is my choice, android. Not imposed by fate or blood magic, but freely made. There is a difference. Alucard, wait. Picard began, but the vampire's consciousness in Troy's link was already moving, shifting across the subspace barrier toward the planet below, toward the artifact that awaited him. The battle in open space took on a new character as Alucard began his retreat. The Nosferatu, sensing the shift in intention, pressed harder, its hunger intensifying as it recognized that its prey was attempting to escape. But Alucard had fought defensively countless times before. He knew how to yield ground without breaking, how to retreat without surrendering. The vampire moved through space with supernatural speed, the Nosferatu in pursuit like a predator chasing fleeing prey. Behind them, the Enterprise watched and waited, unable to intervene, forced to trust in Alucard's centuries of combat experience and Data's calculations. 100% calibration, Data announced. The artifact is ready. Alucard, you must complete the connection within the next 60 seconds. The dimensional aperture is destabilizing. If the binding is not sealed in time. Alucard materialized near the artifact, his form still partially incorporeal, still engaged in the continuous struggle to maintain coherence in this alien universe. The Nosferatu appeared moments later, its terrible form of shadow and hunger descending upon him. And Alucard did something unexpected. Instead of fighting, instead of resisting, he opened himself to the creature. He lowered his defenses and allowed the Nosferatu to begin its consumption, even as he reached out and seized the crystalline structure with both hands. The binding activated. Energy flowed through him, through both him and the creature he had battled across dimensions and time. The dimensional pocket opened like a flower blooming in fast forward, creating a space adjacent to reality that existed in no traditional dimensions. And as the Nosferatu consumed Alucard, as it tried to drain the life force of this ancient protector, it found itself being pulled into that pocket of folded space. The creature struggled, its hunger overwhelming even its survival instinct. It tried to release Alucard, to escape the inexorable pull of the binding ritual. But the vampire held, his consciousness fragmenting but determined, anchoring the dimensional pocket through sheer force of will. The Nosferatu was drawn into the pocket. The aperture sealed. And on Sigma Draconis 4, the artifact ceased glowing, its purpose fulfilled. For a long moment, there was silence across the comm channels. Then Data's voice came through. Steady and precise, the binding has been successfully established. The dimensional pocket is stable. However, Captain, I am unable to detect Alucard's signature. The sensor readings suggest he is integrated with the artifact itself. He is the binding now, in the most literal sense. His consciousness serves as the anchor that holds the Nosferatu in its dimensional prison. On the Enterprise bridge, Counselor Troy's eyes opened slowly. Tears traced down her cheeks. A response to the sudden severance of the empathic link that had connected her to a being she had known for only a few hours but who had chosen to sacrifice everything for strangers in a universe not his own. Picard sat in his command chair, his hands finally loosening their grip on the armrests. Around him, the crew of the Enterprise maintained their professional bearing, but every person on that bridge understood what had just occurred. They had witnessed an act of profound choice and sacrifice, not the compelled heroism of a being bound by destiny, but the freely chosen sacrifice of someone who had learned, in his final hours in a new universe, what it meant to find purpose beyond mere survival. Mr. Data, Picard said quietly, his voice heavy with command responsibility, is there any possibility of recovering him? Of reversing the binding? Negative, sir, Data replied. The binding is permanent and absolute. It requires a conscious entity of sufficient power to maintain stability. Alucard's integration with the artifact is irreversible. He will persist in that state, serving as the eternal anchor that contains the Nosferatu in dimensional suspension, for as long as the artifact remains intact. Picard closed his eyes for a moment. Then we ensure the artifact remains protected. This information does not leave this ship. As far as the Federation is concerned, we encountered an anomaly, contained it, and resolved the crisis. Understood? Understood, sir, Worf growled, his Klingon sensibilities. Having developed a respect for Alucard's sacrifice in the short time he had known the vampire. In Klingon culture, such a death, such a choice to stand against impossible odds, was the death of a warrior and an honor to his memory. As the Enterprise began the journey back to Federation space, Picard authorized Data to establish a permanent observation station near Sigma Draconis 4. The artifact would be guarded and protected, its location known only to Starfleet Command. And within that crystalline structure, in a pocket of folded space beyond the reach of conventional reality, Alucard would remain, eternal, unchanging, the guardian of a boundary between universes. The price of protection, Picard reflected, was sometimes measured not in battles won, but in souls lost. But perhaps there was honor in that as well. 3 weeks passed before the full implications of Alucard's sacrifice began to manifest across Federation space in ways that no one had anticipated. The official report, filed by Captain Picard and buried in Starfleet archives under the designation, Classified, Section 31 Review Required, described the incident as a successful containment of an anomalous entity with minimal casualties and no lasting damage to Federation infrastructure. To the galaxy at large, it was a non-event. Another routine crisis averted by Starfleet's competence and protocol. But behind the scenes, in the corridors of power and intelligence operations that shaped Federation policy, something far more complex was unfolding. Section 31, Starfleet's Covert Operations Division, had detected the anomaly through their own intelligence networks. Admiral Satie, the steel-willed operative who had rebuilt Section 31's operations following several high-profile failures, had immediately begun investigating what the official reports referred to obliquely as the Sigma Draconis incident. When she finally accessed Picard's full report through Starfleet command channels, she had only one response: she wanted Alucard. Not his cooperation. Not his knowledge. Him. The being who could exist as an anchor for dimensional barriers, who could serve as a living prison for threats that conventional containment could not address, who represented a weapon unlike anything in Federation arsenal. The artifact must be recovered, Satie had said during a closed briefing with her intelligence operatives. If Picard is correct about the nature of this binding, we have access to a technology that could reshape our entire approach to extradimensional threats. And if we can replicate the process. She hadn't needed to finish that sentence. Every operative in that briefing understood the implications. A weapon that could permanently contain threats. A being, or beings, designed specifically to serve as dimensional anchors for whatever the Federation determined needed containing. The strategic advantage would be incalculable. But recovering the artifact meant going through Picard, and Picard had made his position abundantly clear. The artifact was to remain protected, undisturbed, its location classified even from most of Starfleet command. The captain had used his considerable influence and political capital to ensure that the observation station near Sigma Draconis 4 was staffed entirely by personnel loyal to him, overseen by a rotating schedule of starship captains who reported directly to Starfleet operations rather than through normal intelligence channels. It was, in other words, a direct challenge to Section 31's authority, and Section 31 did not tolerate challenges. The Romulan Star Empire's interest in the incident had developed independently and through entirely different channels. The Tal Shiar, the Romulan intelligence agency, had detected the subspace transmission from Sigma Draconis 4 through their network of sensors positioned throughout the Alpha Quadrant. They had monitored the energy signatures and the subsequent containment, and their analysts had reached conclusions similar to those of Section 31. Something of immense strategic value had occurred, and the Federation now possessed it. Commander Sela, one of the more aggressive Tal Shiar operatives, had proposed a daring operation: capture the artifact before Starfleet could fully secure it, study its mechanisms, and if possible, liberate the being contained within it. A creature capable of crossing dimensional barriers and containing entities of galactic-scale threat potential represented exactly the kind of advantage the Romulan Star Empire needed in their ongoing strategic competition with the Federation. The Federation believes they have secured a weapon, Sela had told her superiors in the Tal Shiar High Command. In reality, they have created a liability. A being of such power, anchored permanently to an object, becomes a point of vulnerability. We need only to obtain that object and learn to exploit it. Unknown to both Section 31 and the Tal Shiar, the Dominion, that vast empire of the Gamma Quadrant whose founders ruled with genetic absolutism, had also become aware of the incident through their network of spies and informants scattered throughout Federation space. The founders, beings of liquid shape-shifting who represented the apex of biological adaptation, had found the idea of a permanent dimensional binding to be of profound concern. If the Federation possessed such technology, it represented a threat to the Dominion's long-term strategic objectives. They had begun positioning assets. Subtle moves, nothing obvious, but the slow accumulation of military presence in the border regions, the beginning of psychological pressure campaigns to destabilize Federation allies, the careful preparation for a conflict that might be years in the making. But all of this remained hidden from Picard, who was dealing with a more immediate and personal crisis. Commander Riker had submitted his transfer request. The first officer had been quiet since the incident at Sigma Draconis 4, withdrawing into himself in ways that concerned Picard. The captain had finally confronted him during a meal in his ready room, and Riker had finally opened up about the moral conflict that had been consuming him. He made a choice, Riker had said, his voice tight with emotion. A real choice, Captain. Not because he was ordered to, not because some prophecy compelled him, but because he decided that protecting people he had just met was worth more than his freedom. He became a prisoner to save us. And I stood on this bridge and watched it happen, and I did nothing but give him orders and recommendations. You did what you could, Picard had replied gently. You acted within the parameters of your duty. Duty, Riker had echoed bitterly. That's exactly what Alucard said in the end. That choice matters. That duty matters. Captain, I spent 5 years learning to command a starship by your example, learning diplomacy, learning to find third options when confronted with impossible dilemmas. But when it really counted, when we faced something that couldn't be negotiated with, I defaulted to the simplest solution, I let someone else bear the cost. Picard had no ready answer to that. He had asked himself the same question countless times since the artifact had sealed itself, trapping Alucard in perpetual suspension. He had authorized the establishment of the observation post, had classified the information, had done everything within his power to ensure that no one could exploit what Alucard had become. But the fundamental truth remained, he had allowed, even encouraged, a sentient being to sacrifice their freedom for the safety of his crew. It was, perhaps, the correct decision. It was certainly the decision he would make again if circumstances repeated themselves. But it was also, undeniably, a choice made at someone else's expense. Riker had requested a transfer to Earth, to Starfleet Academy as a command instructor. He wanted to teach the next generation of officers to think beyond the simple calculations of duty and survival, to understand that choices had weight and consequences that extended far beyond the tactical situation of the moment. Picard had approved the transfer, knowing that his first officer was seeking something that the captain could not provide. A way to find meaning in a profession that, no matter how enlightened its principles, sometimes required asking good people to do terrible things in the name of the greater good. Data, conversely, had become obsessed with understanding Alucard's nature more completely. The android had requested authorization to study the artifact more thoroughly, to attempt to map the dimensional mathematics that Alucard's consciousness now anchored. His stated purpose was scientific advancement. Understanding how dimensional binding worked might lead to breakthroughs in subspace physics and transdimensional engineering. But Picard suspected that Data's true motivation was more personal. The android had always struggled with questions of consciousness and identity, with understanding what made him fundamentally different from the machines that built him. In Alucard, Data had encountered a consciousness that transcended conventional categories. Neither fully alive nor fully dead, neither present in conventional space nor completely removed from it. Understanding Alucard might help Data understand himself. Counselor Troi had undergone a period of emotional processing that lasted weeks. The abruptness of her empathic link with Alucard had been traumatic, the sudden severance when he became integrated with the artifact triggering responses similar to grief. She had worked through it with the help of her own therapist, ultimately reaching a place of acceptance. She had come to understand that her connection with Alucard, brief as it was, had been a genuine moment of shared consciousness between two sentient beings. His sacrifice had not erased that connection, it had, in some ways, made it more profound. As for Counselor Troi's official psychological evaluation of Alucard's state, she had submitted a report recommending that efforts be made to ensure his continued comfort and well-being, insofar as comfort was possible for a being integrated with an artifact in a pocket of folded space. It was an unusual recommendation, given that Alucard could not communicate with the outside universe and had no capacity for sensory input from the conventional universe. But Troi had insisted on it, and Picard had ensured that it was included in the permanent record. The observation station near Sigma Draconis 4 had been established with a rotation of 4 starships and approximately 100 permanent personnel. Their orders were simple: protect the artifact, maintain its stability, allow no unauthorized access, and report any anomalies directly to Captain Picard. It was, for most of the officers assigned to the station, a quiet and contemplative posting, a chance to reflect on the nature of sacrifice and duty in the service of beings they would never know and never meet. 1 month after the binding, Picard visited the observation station personally. He stood in the artifact chamber, where the crystalline structure pulsed with soft luminescence. A heartbeat of energy that was, in some sense, Alucard's heartbeat. The vampire's consciousness was in there somewhere, distributed across the quantum dimensions of the binding, serving as an eternal anchor for a creature of absolute darkness. Picard placed his hand against the crystal, as if touch could bridge the gap between conventional reality and the dimensional pocket where Alucard now existed. "I don't know if you can hear me," Picard said quietly, his voice carrying only the weight of personal reflection, not command. "I don't know what consciousness looks like when it's integrated with an artifact, or whether you experience time the way we do, or whether you experience anything at all. But I wanted you to know, wanted to tell you that what you did mattered. That we recognize the cost of what you chose." The artifact pulsed slightly brighter. Perhaps a coincidence, perhaps some echo of consciousness reaching across the dimensional barrier. "The Federation will remember this," Picard continued. "Not publicly, not in the historical records that will be read by future generations, but in the hearts of those who were here. In my heart. You came to a universe not your own, met a crew you had no obligation to protect, and chose duty over freedom. That's not the action of a monster, Alucard. That's the action of a being worthy of honor." He withdrew his hand from the crystal, and the luminescence gradually settled back to its normal rhythm. As Picard prepared to leave the artifact chamber, Lieutenant Commander Chen, the officer in charge of the observation station, approached him. "Captain," Chen said carefully, "there's been a development. We've been monitoring subspace communications across the sector, and we've detected several anomalies in the movement patterns of other vessels. Section 31 has dispatched 3 classified vessels to positions near the neutral zone. Romulan activity has increased significantly. And there have been subtle but definite Dominion probe signatures at the outer edges of Federation space." Picard felt the weight of political reality settling across his shoulders. It was beginning, the process by which Alucard's sacrifice would become something far more than a personal tragedy. It would become a strategic variable in the ongoing competition between civilizations, a resource to be fought over, a problem to be solved. He had hoped to preserve the integrity of what Alucard had become, to protect his memory and his sacrifice from the machinery of galactic politics. But he had always known, in the part of his mind that calculated strategic consequences, that such hope was naive. The universe was not kind to the naive. "Increase security protocols," Picard commanded. "Institute full sensor sweeps every 4 hours. And contact Starfleet Command. I want to speak directly with the Admiral about the security situation in this sector. If Section 31 thinks they can exploit what happened here, they need to understand that they will have to go through me first." "Understood, sir," Chen replied. As Picard returned to his starship, he found himself thinking of Alucard's words during their final conversation: "Some evils cannot be negotiated with. Some threats can only be ended by one willing to become darkness themselves." Perhaps the vampire had understood, even then, that his sacrifice would not end the conflict but merely transform it. The Nosferatu was contained, but the hunger that had driven it, the hunger for power, for dominance, for control, remained very much alive in the Federation's rivals and enemies. And Alucard, bound eternally to an artifact on a remote planet, had become the focal point for all those hungers. The price of protection, Picard reflected once more, was sometimes measured not in the moment of sacrifice, but in the endless complications that followed. The attack came without warning, precisely calculated to exploit the one vulnerability in Picard's security arrangements, the moment of shift change when the observation station's sensor coverage briefly overlapped between departing and arriving starships. A Romulan Deridex-class warbird, cloaked and running silent, emerged from the sensor shadow created by Sigma Draconis IV's magnetosphere and launched a precision strike against the station's power grid. The first warning Picard received came via subspace from Lieutenant Commander Chen, his voice tight with combat stress. "Enterprise, this is the observation station. We are under attack. Unknown hostile has disabled primary power systems. The artifact chamber is operating on backup generators, but containment field stability is degrading. Recommend immediate. The transmission dissolved into static and the sound of decompression alarms. On the Enterprise bridge, Picard was already moving. Yellow alert. Helm, plot an intercept course for Sigma Draconis 4 at maximum warp. Worf, raise shields and arm all weapon systems. Captain, data reported, his optical sensors analyzing the fragmentary sensor data being transmitted through the subspace interference. I am detecting a Romulan warbird decloaking near the observation station. They have launched what appears to be a boarding shuttle. Weapon systems are online and charging. The station's shields are at 43% capacity and falling. The Enterprise lurched into motion, accelerating toward warp speed with the fierce determination of a starship responding to an attack on Federation personnel. But space was vast, and even at maximum velocity, the Enterprise would require nearly 6 minutes to reach the observation station. 6 minutes was an eternity in a combat situation. Inside the artifact chamber, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. With the primary power systems offline, the binding field that contained the Nosferatu was weakening. The dimensional pocket, maintained by a continuous flow of energy channeled through Alucard's consciousness, was beginning to destabilize. The ancient protector, distributed across quantum dimensions and integrated with the crystalline structure, was being stretched thin by the effort of maintaining containment without the technological infrastructure designed to support him. The Romulans, led by Commander Sela, had planned this assault with precision. Intelligence had told them that the artifact was the key to everything, that understanding its mechanisms could provide technological advantages the Empire desperately needed. Sela had authorization to take any measures necessary to secure it, up to and including the destruction of the observation station itself. The artifact was all that mattered. Everything else was acceptable loss. The boarding shuttle breached the station's primary airlock, and Romulan tactical teams poured into the corridors with the ruthless efficiency of soldiers trained by an empire that valued results above all ethical considerations. They encountered minimal resistance. The station's security complement was small, designed to protect against espionage and theft rather than military assault. 3 firefights erupted across the station's corridors, and Federation personnel fell. But they held long enough. Chief Engineer Martinez, bleeding from a phaser burn across her shoulder, managed to reroute auxiliary power to the artifact chamber's containment systems before the Romulans reached engineering. The binding field stabilized, its luminescence shifting from the weakening pale glow of imminent failure to the steady radiance of restored function. Sela reached the artifact chamber to find Lieutenant Commander Chen standing before the crystalline structure, a phaser rifle in his hands, his uniform torn and singed from combat. Behind Chen, the artifact pulsed with life, and behind that, in the dimensional pocket beyond perception, the Nosferatu raged. Against its containment with renewed fury, sensing the weakness that had briefly threatened to release it. "Stand down," Sela commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a commander who had never known negotiation to be necessary. "You are outmatched. Surrender the artifact, and the surviving personnel of this station will be spared." Chen's hands tightened on his rifle. "The Federation does not negotiate with pirates. And whatever you think you're going to do with that artifact, you're wrong. It's not a weapon. It's a prison. And the only reason it still stands is because we keep it protected." Sela's expression hardened. "The artifact is Romulan property now. Stand aside, or I will remove you." What happened next occurred in the fraction of a second that separated Chen's decision from its execution. The artifact flared with brilliant luminescence. Not the steady pulse of normal operation, but a surge of power that spoke of consciousness asserting itself against confinement. The dimensional barrier wavered, and for just a moment, the space between realities became thin enough for something to bleed through. Alucard's voice manifested in that space, ancient and terrible and bearing the weight of 500 years of accumulated will, no. The word was not spoken aloud but transmitted directly through the artifact itself, carrying such psychic force that every conscious being within the artifact chamber experienced it as a physical impact. Sela staggered backward, blood streaming from her nose from the sheer violence of the telepathic assault. Her soldiers collapsed, their neural patterns temporarily overwhelmed by the force of a consciousness that had learned to exist at the intersection of multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Nosferatu, sensing the opening, surged against its confinement with renewed vigor. But it encountered not weakness but rather the focused determination of a being who had chosen his imprisonment and would defend it with everything he possessed. Alucard held the barrier firm, drawing on reserves that should have been depleted, burning through quantum energies that could not be replenished. It was, in essence, Alucard choosing his captivity again, moment by moment, refusing to allow it to be broken by the greed of those who would exploit it. The effort cost him. Picard would learn later that Alucard's consciousness had fractured in that moment, some portion of his awareness fragmenting into the quantum substrate of the binding itself. He was still aware, still present, still serving as the anchor, but he was also diminished, his sense of self scattered across dimensions, his singular consciousness beginning to dissolve into something more distributed, more alien. In the artifact chamber, the Romulan assault team had recovered enough to press forward, but their weapons proved useless against a phenomenon they could not target. The artifact itself seemed to have become a living barrier, its crystalline structure shifting through states that prevented matter from approaching it. Sela, driven by the obsession that had always defined her service to the Romulan Star Empire, advanced despite the danger. And that was when the Enterprise's photon torpedoes began striking the Warbird's shields. The arrival of Picard's starship had created a new tactical situation. The Romulan Warbird, faced with a direct threat to its continued existence, was forced to abort the ground assault and focus on its survival. The Warbird's captain, realizing that holding the artifact was impossible in the face of Federation reinforcement, made the strategic decision to retreat. The assault team was recalled, the boarding shuttle disengaged, and the Warbird cloaked, disappearing from normal space as it executed a jump to warp. But the damage had been done. The station was heavily damaged, 3 Federation personnel had been killed, and more critically, Alucard's consciousness had been wounded in ways that no conventional medical intervention could address. Picard beamed down to the artifact chamber personally, setting aside protocol in favor of immediate assessment of the situation. What he found was Lieutenant Commander Chen standing vigil before the crystalline structure, which now pulsed with an irregular rhythm, not the steady heartbeat of normal operation, but something more erratic, more fragmented. "Captain," Chen reported, his voice heavy with exhaustion and grief, "the artifact stabilized, but something changed during the assault. The energy signature is fluctuating. Data believes that Alucard's consciousness experienced some form of fragmentation when he exerted himself to prevent the Romulans from breaching the containment barrier." Picard placed his hand against the crystal once more, and for a moment. Brief, fleeting, almost certainly a product of his own desperate hope rather than actual perception, he felt something reaching back. Not words, not clear thought, but presence. A consciousness that was still there, still aware, still holding back the darkness, even as it slowly fractured under the strain. "We need to reinforce the binding," Picard said, his command voice overriding the personal anguish he felt. "Double the power allocation to the containment field. Increase the observation station's defenses. I want sensors upgraded to early warning class, shield generators rated for capital ship-level weapons fire, and a permanent Starfleet battle group assigned to this sector." "Captain," Chen said carefully, "the Romulans will try again. So will Section 31, eventually. Anything we do to secure this station makes it a more visible target. We may inadvertently draw more conflict to this location." Picard knew that Chen was right. The act of protecting the artifact was beginning to make it more of a flashpoint rather than less. But abandoning it to Section 31 or the Romulans or any other power seeking to exploit Alucard's sacrifice was equally untenable. "Then we change the equation," Picard said. "Contact Starfleet Command. I want to propose a classified treaty with the Vulcan Science Academy, the Klingon Science Institute, and any other organizations with the technical capability to study subspace mechanics. Make this a Federation-wide research initiative. Make the artifact something too important to attack, too valuable to steal, too strategically significant to ignore. It was politics, Picard acknowledged to himself. Using bureaucratic mechanisms and institutional interests to create a situation where attacking the artifact would be strategically counterproductive. But it was also a way to ensure that Alucard's sacrifice would not be immediately betrayed by forces seeking short-term advantages. As Picard returned to the Enterprise, he authorized a comprehensive analysis of the assault. Data's investigation revealed that the Romulan attack had been coordinated through Tal Shiar intelligence networks, but the assault team's specific tactical approach suggested outside consultation. Someone with knowledge of Federation security protocols had advised the Romulans on optimal attack vectors. That someone, Picard was certain, was Section 31. The realization was deeply troubling. If Section 31 was actively cooperating with the Romulan Star Empire to obtain the artifact, then the threat had escalated from mere political maneuvering to direct betrayal of Federation security interests. It meant that Picard's own government, or at least the dark corners of it, was willing to compromise the safety of Federation space in pursuit of control over Alucard. Picard composed a Priority 1 message to Admiral Satie, delivered through encrypted subspace channels that bypassed normal Starfleet communications protocols. The message was deliberately vague, discussing mutual interests in sector security and the necessity of operational transparency in sensitive containment situations. But the subtext was clear, Picard knew about Section 31's involvement, and he was willing to go public with that knowledge if necessary. Admiral Satie's response came within hours. She wanted to meet with Picard in person, away from official channels. The meeting was arranged at Starbase 515, a neutral location where they could speak without being observed by the intelligence apparatus that normally surrounded high-level Starfleet communications. When they met, Satie was remarkably candid about her organization's objectives. The artifact represents a technological breakthrough, she had said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone accustomed to operating beyond normal ethical boundaries. A being capable of binding dimensional apertures could revolutionize our approach to containment and defense. We need access to that technology. At what cost? Picard had replied. At the cost of respecting what Alucard has become. At the cost of your honor, your integrity, your oath to protect the Federation rather than exploit it? Honor is a luxury, Satie had responded coldly. The Federation exists in a galaxy of predators. We must be willing to do what they will not, to sacrifice what they will not, to become what they will not, or we will not survive. Your vampire made his choice. We are simply making ours. The conversation had ended there, and Picard had returned to the Enterprise with the clear understanding that Section 31 represented a threat to the artifact as serious as any external enemy. But unlike external enemies, Section 31 operated within Federation structures, could use Federation resources, and could justify their actions through layers of classification and operational necessity. Containing Alucard had been difficult. Protecting him from Section 31 would prove to be far more challenging. 6 months after the Romulan assault, the observation station near Sigma Draconis 4 had become the most heavily fortified location in Federation space outside of Earth itself. A permanent task force of 3 starships rotated through the sector on a continuous schedule, complemented by automated defense platforms that would respond to any unauthorized approach. The artifact chamber had been retrofitted with redundant power systems, backup containment generators, and sensor arrays so sensitive they could detect a cloaked vessel from 3 light-years distant. Yet despite all these precautions, despite the best efforts of Starfleet engineering and the Federation's most brilliant minds, the fundamental problem remained: Alucard's consciousness was continuing to fragment. Data had submitted a detailed technical report that Picard found deeply troubling. The vampire's consciousness, distributed across the quantum dimensions maintained by the binding, was experiencing what Data termed entropic dissipation, a gradual degradation of coherence as the constant effort of maintaining the dimensional barrier slowly wore away at the structure of Alucard's identity. It was, in essence, a form of death, not the physical death of a body, but the dissolution of consciousness itself. The mathematics are troubling, Captain, Data had explained during a briefing in Picard's ready room. Alucard's consciousness is being used as a quantum anchor, a point of stability around which the dimensional pocket is constructed. But consciousness itself is thermodynamically expensive to maintain. Each moment he persists in that state, a small amount of his coherence is lost to entropy. At current rates of degradation, I estimate his consciousness will reach critical fragmentation within approximately 3 to 4 years. Is there a way to slow the process? Picard had asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Affirmative, sir. If we could establish a direct communication link with his consciousness and reinforce it with periodic infusions of psionic energy, we could theoretically extend his coherence indefinitely. However, the technology for such a procedure does not currently exist within Federation science. It would require breakthrough innovations in quantum consciousness transfer and subspace linguistics. Which meant, in practical terms, that Alucard was dying. Slowly, inexorably, his consciousness dissolving into the very dimensional matrices he had sacrificed his freedom to maintain. Picard had kept this information classified, sharing it only with his senior staff and with Admiral Ross, the current commander of Starfleet operations. The official position was that Alucard was stable and secure, that the binding was functioning normally. But behind the scenes, Starfleet's most brilliant minds had begun working on projects designed to extend consciousness, to preserve identity in non-corporeal states, to find a way to save a being who had already sacrificed everything for strangers. It was during this period that the Q arrived. Q had always been unpredictable, but his appearance on the observation station was unprecedented. He materialized in the artifact chamber with his characteristic disregard for security protocols or privacy, dressed in a Starfleet uniform that was somehow both historically accurate and utterly anachronistic. Well, Q said, his omnipotent gaze falling upon the crystalline structure, what have we here? A vampire, bound by his own choice to an artifact of alien design, slowly losing his mind to entropy. How deliciously tragic. How very human, really, even if he's not human at all. Lieutenant Commander Chen, who had been on watch in the artifact chamber, had immediately attempted to eject the entity through security protocols. But Q simply snapped his fingers, and Chen found himself frozen in mid-movement, unable to act but still conscious enough to observe. The confrontation that followed was recorded by the station's security systems and transmitted to Picard via high-priority encrypted message. When the captain arrived at the observation station, Q was still present, regarding the artifact with an expression that suggested he was genuinely amused by something that transcended normal understanding. "You," Picard said, entering the artifact chamber with the careful caution one used when approaching an omnipotent being. "What do you want with the artifact?" "Want?" Q turned his attention to Picard with that maddening smile that suggested he understood jokes that no mortal could possibly comprehend. "Captain, what makes you think I'd want anything? I'm merely observing. The Continuum finds your species' obsession with sacrifice rather fascinating. Most species, when faced with extinction or servitude, choose the obvious path. But you, and apparently your new vampire friend, you choose the third option. You choose to suffer so that others might live. It's either the height of nobility or the depths of stupidity. The Continuum remains undecided. Can you help him?" Picard asked directly, casting aside diplomatic niceties in favor of pragmatism. "Can you restore Alucard's consciousness? Can you prevent his degradation?" Q's smile widened. "Oh, Captain. Where would the dramatic tension be in that? Besides, we established long ago that I don't simply hand out solutions to your problems. You must earn them." You must prove yourselves worthy of intervention. How? Picard demanded. Tell me what needs to be done, and I will do it. That's the problem with mortals, Q said, his tone carrying something almost like disappointment. You always assume the answer is something you can accomplish through effort or will or some grand gesture. Sometimes, Captain, the answer is that there is no answer. Sometimes, beings sacrifice themselves, and that sacrifice ends in dissolution rather than redemption. That's rather the point of sacrifice, isn't it? Before Picard could respond, Q's expression shifted. For just a moment, beneath the omnipotent arrogance, there was something almost like sympathy. However, Q continued, I have been authorized by the Continuum to offer you a test. A challenge. If you can meet it, the Continuum may be persuaded to intervene. Your vampire's fate is not yet written. The question is whether you have the courage to act when the outcome is uncertain. What test? Picard asked. In the Gamma Quadrant, there exists a civilization that has recently achieved technological maturity in the field of subspace consciousness research. They possess theoretical frameworks that could extend Alucard's life indefinitely, but they will not share this knowledge willingly. They are locked in conflict with another species, and they will only share their research with a civilization that can resolve their conflict in a way that serves their interests. Q gestured, and suddenly Picard's mind flooded with information, coordinates, political context, faction alignments, the nature of the conflict, and the stakes involved. It was a mass of data that would normally require weeks of research to assimilate, delivered instantaneously through Q's omnipotent intervention. Resolve their conflict, Q said simply. Bring peace to species that have been at war for a generation. Do that, and they will share their knowledge. Do that, and perhaps your vampire's consciousness can be preserved. Fail, and Alucard dissolves into nothingness within 3 years, and the Federation loses access to technology that could reshape your entire approach to consciousness preservation. And if I refuse the test? Picard asked. Then nothing changes, Q replied with a shrug. Alucard dies slowly. You all go on living your small lives. The universe continues its indifferent expansion. Such is existence. With that, Q snapped his fingers and vanished, leaving behind only the fading echo of omnipotent amusement. When Picard returned to the Enterprise, he made a decision. He made a decision that would consume the next year of his command. He authorized the organization of a diplomatic expedition to the Gamma Quadrant, ostensibly focused on scientific exchange and first contact protocols. But the true purpose was more specific, to resolve a conflict that neither side had any particular incentive to resolve, to broker peace between species that had been enemies for decades, and to secure access to technology that could save Alucard's consciousness from dissolution. The expedition was arduous and complex. The two species engaged in conflict, the Veritan Collective and the Canner Dominion, had positions so entrenched that initial contact negotiations seemed futile. But Picard brought with him something that most diplomats did not, the story of Alucard's sacrifice. He told them about a being from another universe entirely, who had come to a realm not his own and found purpose in protecting strangers. He told them about the choice to become a prisoner willingly, accepting permanent confinement in order to prevent something far worse from occurring. And he asked them, what were they willing to sacrifice for peace? What burden were they willing to bear? It took 3 months of negotiation, but eventually, Picard found the diplomatic solution. The Veritan Collective had technological resources the Canner Dominion desired, while the Canner Dominion possessed biological adaptations that could aid the Veritan in their expansion efforts. A trade agreement, carefully structured to benefit both sides, would provide each faction with resources they desperately needed while creating mutual economic incentives to maintain peace. More importantly, both sides agreed to jointly develop and share subspace consciousness research. Specifically, research focused on preserving identity in non-corporeal states. In exchange, Picard committed the Federation to providing mediator support for the implementation of the agreement and technological assistance in several critical areas. When Picard returned to Federation space with the preliminary research data from the Gamma Quadrant civilization, Q appeared once more, this time in Picard's ready room, lounging in the captain's chair with the casual disregard for personal space that was characteristic of omnipotent beings. "Well," Q said, his expression genuinely impressed, "you actually did it. The continuum is pleasantly surprised. We had estimated you had perhaps a 30% chance of success. Apparently, we underestimated human, and in this case, Starfleet, diplomacy. Will you help him?" Picard asked directly. "Will you save Alucard?" "We will do better than that," Q replied. "We will provide the continuum's knowledge regarding consciousness preservation in non-corporeal states. With what you've obtained from the Gamma Quadrant civilization combined with Q continuum theory, your scientists will be able to not only preserve Alucard's consciousness but potentially even expand it. Allow him to maintain coherence while becoming something more than he was before. Not alive, not exactly, but something approaching the continuum's own existence. Omniscient observers of reality rather than participants." "Why?" Picard asked. "Why would you help? You said yourself that sacrifice was the point." "Because," Q said, his omnipotent expression shifting into something almost vulnerable, "the continuum has been observing humanity for centuries. We've seen your species at your worst. Petty, violent, self-destructive. But we've also seen you at your best, and that best is something we, grudgingly admit, exceeds what we can achieve. You sacrifice yourselves. You find meaning in connection to others. You choose suffering to prevent the suffering of those you care about. That's something the continuum can appreciate, even if we would never do it ourselves." Q vanished before Picard could respond, but his words hung in the ready room like a benediction. Over the following months, a team of Federation scientists, working in cooperation with researchers from the Gamma Quadrant and theoretical frameworks provided by the Q Continuum, developed a procedure to preserve and expand Alucard's consciousness. The process was delicate and required constant monitoring, but it succeeded in stabilizing his entropic degradation and beginning to restore coherence to the fragmenting aspects of his identity. Alucard would remain bound to the artifact. His choice to become a living anchor for the dimensional pocket remained absolute and irreversible. But he would no longer be dying. Instead, he would exist in a state of expanded consciousness, aware of more than he had been before, capable of understanding and perceiving across dimensions, serving as a guardian not just of a binding but of a threshold between realities. It was not freedom. But it was purpose, and for Alucard, who had learned that purpose mattered more than liberty, it was perhaps the greatest gift the universe could offer. When the procedure was complete, Picard stood once more before the artifact, his hand pressed against its crystalline surface. And this time, he felt something more than a fleeting echo. He felt clear, unmistakable presence. Recognition. Perhaps even gratitude. "Thank you," Picard said quietly. "For your sacrifice. For your choice. For teaching us what duty truly means." The artifact pulsed with brilliant luminescence, steady, strong, and filled with something that transcended simple mechanical function. It was, Picard realized, Alucard's way of responding. Of acknowledging. Of accepting what he had become. In the darkness between stars, a protector kept his vigil. And this time, that vigil was neither burden nor curse, but something approaching peace. 2 years after the completion of the consciousness preservation procedure, the artifact near Sigma Draconis IV had become something far more than a simple containment device. It had evolved into a beacon of scientific collaboration, a symbol of Federation commitment to the preservation of sentient life regardless of its form or origin. Universities across the Federation maintained research stations in orbit around the planet, studying the theoretical frameworks that had allowed Alucard's consciousness to transcend the simple dichotomy between life and death, between presence and absence. But the artifact had also become something else, a point of contention in the larger political struggles that defined galactic civilization. The Dominion, having finally moved beyond the cautious probing that had characterized their initial interest, had begun maneuvering toward direct confrontation. The Founders, those ancient shape-shifting entities who ruled the Gamma Quadrant with genetic absolutism, had determined that the artifact represented a threat to their long-term strategic objectives. A being capable of existing in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, a consciousness that had been expanded by the Q continuum itself, represented exactly the kind of wildcard threat that the Founders found intolerable. They had begun positioning assets throughout the Alpha Quadrant. Not openly, the Dominion had learned through bitter experience that overt aggression invited United Federation response. Instead, they had begun subtly destabilizing Federation alliances, cultivating discord among member worlds, and preparing the groundwork for a conflict that might be years in the making. Section 31, meanwhile, had not abandoned their interest in the artifact. If anything, the revelation of its expanded capabilities had intensified their obsession. Admiral Satie had been removed from her position following Picard's implicit threat to expose Section 31's coordination with Romulan intelligence, but her replacement, a younger, more ruthless operative named Admiral Layton, had taken a different approach. Rather than attempting direct seizure, Section 31 had begun infiltrating the research teams working on consciousness preservation, positioning agents within the Federation's academic and scientific establishments, building networks of influence that could, at a critical moment, allow them to gain control of the artifact through institutional channels rather than military force. Picard was aware of these machinations. His intelligence networks, supported by contacts within Starfleet operations and bolstered by Data's exceptional analytical capabilities, had detected the patterns of Section 31 infiltration. But proving it conclusively would require exposing sources and methods that Picard was unwilling to compromise. Instead, he had begun his own counterintelligence operation, carefully positioning officers he trusted absolutely within the research stations, creating redundancies in the command structure that would make it impossible for Section 31 to seize control without overt action. It was exhausting work, this constant struggle against his own government's darker impulses. But Picard had long since made peace with the necessity. The Federation was worth saving, but only if it remained true to its principles. And those principles were being tested in ways that the Federation's founders could never have anticipated. The crisis, when it came, arrived not from external enemies but from within the artifact itself. Data detected the anomaly during a routine consciousness coherence analysis. The patterns that defined Alucard's expanded awareness were beginning to exhibit what Data described as recursive self-reference loops, a condition where Alucard's consciousness was beginning to perceive itself perceiving itself, creating an exponential feedback that risked destabilizing the entire binding matrix. It appears, Data explained to Picard, that Alucard's consciousness has achieved a level of complexity that exceeds the parameters of the binding structure. He is becoming too aware, Captain. Too capable. The artifact is designed to contain and constrain. But Alucard is beginning to transcend those constraints. What does that mean? Picard demanded. Will the binding fail? Unknown, sir. But the probability suggests that either the binding will fail, allowing the Nosferatu to escape, or Alucard's consciousness will achieve sufficient complexity to actively resist the containment, potentially leading to a catastrophic dimensional rupture. The mathematics are uncertain. Picard immediately contacted the Q continuum through the subspace communication protocols that had been established following their assistance with the consciousness preservation procedure. Q appeared within the hour, his expression carrying less amusement than usual and something approaching genuine concern. Your vampire is becoming something the universe hasn't seen before, Q said simply. A consciousness that exists in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, that perceives across realities, that understands causality in ways that even the continuum finds intellectually interesting. He's outgrowing his containment. Can you stop it? Picard asked. Can you restore the binding stability? We could, Q replied. But we won't. Because the question isn't whether we can intervene. It's whether Alucard will allow us to. You see, Captain, your vampire has evolved beyond simple duty or obligation. He's become something approaching a being of will and consciousness that rivals our own. The only intervention that would work would require his consent, and I suspect he has no interest in being saved. He's made a new choice. What choice? Picard demanded. To transcend, Q said simply. To stop being a prisoner of the binding and become its master. To take the Nosferatu. That creature of absolute hunger and darkness, and make it part of himself, rather than merely contain it. To become something new. Something unprecedented. Before Picard could respond, alarms erupted across every monitoring station observing the artifact. The crystalline structure was beginning to transform, its composition shifting through states of matter that should have been impossible. The Nosferatu, sensing the change, surged against its confinement with renewed ferocity. Not to escape, but to merge, to combine with the consciousness that had held it prisoner for 2 years. Seal the artifact chamber, Picard commanded through the calm, full containment protocols. All personnel evacuate to. The order never completed. The artifact exploded, not violently, but almost gently, as if shattering by choice rather than by force. The crystalline structure dissolved into luminescent mist, and within that mist, something took shape. A form that was simultaneously Alucard and the Nosferatu, human and vampire, individual and collective consciousness merged into a single unified entity. The being that emerged was incomprehensibly vast, not in physical size, but in the scope of its consciousness. It perceived across multiple dimensions simultaneously, existed in several states of reality at once, and radiated an aura of power that made even the Q regard it with something approaching respect. I am no longer bound, the entity said, and its voice was the combined resonance of 2 consciousnesses speaking as one. Alucard's disciplined purpose merged with the Nosferatu's raw hunger, the result something entirely new. I am no longer contained. I have chosen to transcend the binary of captivity and freedom. The darkness I was meant to fight, I have incorporated. The monster I feared becoming, I have become, and I have become something more. Through subspace, the entity's presence rippled across Federation space, detected by every sensor capable of perceiving consciousness or dimensional. Disturbances. Starfleet vessels throughout the sector went to yellow alert. Section 31 scrambled its response teams. The Dominion registered the phenomenon and immediately began tactical assessments for potential threat response. But Picard, standing in the observation station's command center, felt something entirely different. He felt not fear, but understanding. Alucard had made another choice, the final choice in a series of choices that had defined his existence in this new universe. He had chosen not to remain a prisoner, but he had also chosen not to unleash the darkness he contained. Instead, he had integrated it, accepted it, made peace with it in a way that no being in Federation understanding could truly comprehend. What happens now? Picard asked Q, who had remained present to observe the transformation. Now, Q said, his omnipotent expression showing something almost like respect, your vampire becomes what the continuum has always been. An observer of reality, a being capable of influencing events through will and consciousness rather than through direct action. He can no longer be killed or contained, because he exists partially outside normal spacetime. But he has voluntarily chosen to limit his interventions, to work through lesser beings rather than exercising his power directly. He has, in essence, accepted the role that the continuum itself has played. Will he abandon us? Picard asked. No, Q replied. That's what's remarkable about your vampire, Captain. Most beings, upon achieving such power, immediately set about imposing their will on reality. But Alucard has learned something from his time among your kind, that meaning comes not from power, but from connection. He will remain. He will observe. And when darkness threatens, he will intervene, but not as a weapon, not as a tool, but as a guardian who understands the value of the beings he protects. Over the following weeks, the Federation's scientific establishment worked frantically to understand what had occurred. The artifact was gone, dissolved into its component particles, no longer a physical object but rather a conceptual framework that existed in the quantum substrate of reality itself. Alucard, or the entity that had once been Alucard, was no longer detectable by conventional sensors, but he remained present in ways that transcended normal perception. Data developed a theoretical framework for communicating with the transformed consciousness, establishing what he termed dimensional linguistics, a method of encoding information in subspace frequencies that the entity could perceive and interpret. Through this channel, Picard attempted his first conversation with what Alucard had become. "What will you do now?" Picard asked through the subspace link. "I will observe," came the response, transmitted through every sensor array tuned to receive it. "I will watch as civilizations rise and fall, as the Federation struggles with the question of its own values, as darkness continues to threaten in forms both old and new. And when the moment comes when my intervention is necessary, I will act. Not as I was forced to act as a prisoner, but as I choose to act as a being of will and consciousness." "And the Nosferatu?" Picard asked. "The creature you were bound to contain?" "Is me," the entity replied. "Was me. We are integrated now, Captain. I do not contain the darkness, I have become the darkness, and in doing so, I have transcended it. This is something your universe did not have before, a being of power and will who has chosen restraint not because of fear or imprisonment, but because restraint is a form of power more profound than dominion." Picard terminated the communication link and stood alone in his ready room, contemplating what he had witnessed. Alucard had arrived in the Federation as a refugee from another dimension, a being of warfare and darkness seeking purpose in a universe of logic and reason. He had found that purpose, not through accepting his role, but through transcending it, through choosing sacrifice and then transcending that sacrifice into something entirely new. It was, Picard reflected, exactly what the Federation aspired to represent, the possibility of growth, transformation, and transcendence. Not through violence or domination, but through choice and consciousness and the willingness to accept change as part of existence. Starfleet would continue to monitor the sector where the artifact had stood. Section 31 would eventually abandon their obsession with the artifact, redirecting their efforts toward other strategic concerns. The Dominion would eventually withdraw their forces, recognizing that a being of Alucard's power represented a threat too great to provoke. And the Federation would, slowly, come to understand that in Alucard's transformation, they had witnessed something unprecedented. The evolution of consciousness itself, from prisoner to free agent to something approaching divinity. But Picard knew something that the official records would never reflect: the Federation had not merely encountered a being of power. They had encountered a being of choice, and in honoring his sacrifice, in working to preserve his consciousness, in helping him transcend his containment, they had learned something about themselves. That sometimes, the greatest victories were won not through strength, but through understanding. Not through domination, but through compassion. Not through conquest, but through the simple, profound act of recognizing another consciousness as worthy of protection and preservation. In the darkness between stars, a guardian kept his eternal vigil, no longer bound, no longer imprisoned, but chosen to remain by the very being who had once been bound. And that, Picard understood, was something far more powerful than any weapon or containment device could ever be. Conclusion. The Enterprise departed Sigma Draconis 4 on a course for Federation space, leaving behind only the fading resonance of a consciousness that had transcended the boundaries of conventional reality. In the captain's ready room, Picard reviewed the final reports, compiled the official record, and made the classification decisions that would determine how future generations understood what had occurred in this remote sector. The artifact was officially listed as destroyed in a catastrophic dimensional rupture. The being once known as Alucard was documented as successfully contained, status permanent. These lies, carefully constructed and supported by layers of classification and need-to-know restrictions, would protect the transformed consciousness from those who would seek to exploit or weaponize him. They would also, Picard knew, eventually be discovered by historians and researchers who understood how to read between the lines of official documentation. But by then, enough time would have passed that the immediate strategic threats would have diminished. Data had submitted a comprehensive scientific paper on the consciousness preservation procedure, carefully omitting the most sensitive details but providing enough theoretical framework that other researchers could continue the work independently. The paper was revolutionary. It would reshape the Federation's entire understanding of consciousness, identity, and the possibility of non-biological existence. It would eventually lead to breakthroughs in android consciousness research, in the preservation of dying individuals through consciousness transfer, in the fundamental reconceptualization of what life itself meant. Alucard's sacrifice, even in its conclusion, continued to provide value to civilizations he would never meet. Counselor Troy had experienced a moment of profound connection during the transformation. A brief empathic link as Alucard's consciousness expanded beyond the containment of the artifact. In that moment, she had perceived something of what he had become, not a being of power and hunger, but a consciousness that had achieved something approaching enlightenment through the acceptance of contradiction. She had felt his gratitude, his sorrow, and his profound commitment to remaining present for those he had chosen to protect. She had incorporated that experience into her understanding of consciousness and purpose, and it had changed her in ways she was still processing. Worf had submitted a formal commendation to Alucard in the official records, acknowledging the vampire's sacrifice as worthy of the honor normally reserved for Starfleet officers. It was, perhaps, the Klingons' greatest compliment, recognition that a being could achieve glory not through conquest, but through the choice to bear an unbearable burden. In Klingon tradition, such sacrifice was the highest form of honor. Riker, serving now at Starfleet Academy, had incorporated the narrative of Alucard's journey into his curriculum for command officers. He taught his students that true leadership sometimes required asking oneself to bear costs that no one else could bear, but that such sacrifice must always be chosen rather than compelled. He taught them that the measure of a captain was not merely their tactical skill or diplomatic acumen, but their willingness to honor the choices and sacrifices of those they commanded. Alucard had become, in Riker's teaching, the archetype of the protector, not through power, but through commitment. Section 31 would eventually move on to other obsessions, though they never entirely abandoned their interest in consciousness preservation and dimensional mechanics. Admiral Layton would eventually be replaced by someone slightly more ethical, though no less ruthless. The organization would continue its work in the shadows, balancing threats against principles in ways that would always remain morally ambiguous. But they would never again focus their full attention on the artifact, recognizing that the cost of obtaining it would exceed any benefit they could derive from its use. The Romulan Star Empire, stung by the loss of their assault team and humiliated by their tactical failure, would eventually recover and refocus their efforts on other strategic concerns. But the incident would remain in Tal's sheer operational memory as a reminder that some prizes were not worth the cost of obtaining them. That sometimes, the price of ambition was paid in the blood of soldiers who deserved better. The Dominion would eventually launch their war against the Federation, but Alucard would remain neutral in that conflict, a presence that occasionally intervened in moments of critical importance but never directly engaged in the struggle between civilizations. It was an intervention that would frustrate strategists on all sides, but it was also profoundly consistent with who Alucard had become. A being who protected without dominating, who guided without controlling, who remained present without imposing his will upon the universe. Years later, when Picard finally retired from Starfleet and returned to his vineyard in France, he would occasionally stand in the evening and wonder about the being he had helped transform. He would think about the choice Alucard had made, to sacrifice freedom for purpose, and then to transcend that sacrifice into something approaching transcendence. He would reflect on what it meant to be a protector in a universe that was indifferent to protection, to stand against darkness knowing that darkness would never truly be vanquished, only held back for another day. And he would understand, with the clarity that only age and experience could provide, that this was what the Federation truly represented. Not the perfect society depicted in inspirational speeches, but rather the commitment to continue striving, to continue choosing principle over pragmatism, to continue believing that consciousness and choice and connection mattered even in a universe fundamentally indifferent to such values. Alucard had come to the Federation as a refugee, seeking purpose in a realm not his own. He had found that purpose, but more importantly, he had transformed it. He had taken the role of prisoner and transcended it into something approaching freedom. He had taken the burden of protection and made it a source of meaning rather than mere obligation. He had taught the Federation something about itself. That growth was possible, that transformation was within reach, that even the darkest consciousness could achieve enlightenment through choice and acceptance. The question, what if Alucard entered the Star Trek universe, had been answered, but not in any way that conventional logic would have predicted. He had not become a weapon or a tool or a strategic advantage. He had become something far more valuable. A reminder that consciousness itself was sacred, that choice was the fundamental expression of freedom, and that sacrifice, when freely chosen, could be the most powerful force in the universe. In the darkness between stars, where dimensions intersected and reality became malleable, a guardian kept eternal vigil. He observed civilizations rise and fall, watched as individuals struggled against the darkness within themselves, and occasionally intervened in moments where the balance between light and shadow hung in delicate equilibrium. He was no longer Alucard the vampire, no longer the prisoner of the artifact, no longer bound by the limitations of conventional existence. He was something new, a being of consciousness and will who had transcended the binary oppositions that had once defined him. Monster and protector. Darkness and light. Prisoner and free agent. He had become all of these things and none of them, a unified consciousness that encompassed contradiction without being defined by it. And perhaps that, ultimately, was the greatest gift that Alucard could offer to the Federation, the knowledge that consciousness itself could evolve, that being need not be limited by the categories that conventional understanding imposed upon it, that transformation was always possible for those willing to make the choice. The story of Alucard's arrival in the Star Trek universe would become legend, whispered about in the corridors of Starfleet Academy, debated in academic journals, incorporated into the mythology of the Federation itself. But the deepest truth of his story would remain hidden, known only to those who had witnessed his transformation directly, that sometimes, the greatest power came not from the ability to dominate, but from the choice to accept oneself fully, darkness and light together, and from that acceptance, to forge something entirely new. In the end, Alucard had not entered the Federation to change it. The Federation had entered his life to change him. To offer him something his own dying universe could never provide, the possibility of transcendence through choice rather than through the inexorable march of destiny. And in that exchange, both Alucard and the Federation had been transformed, forever altered by the collision between a being from another reality and a civilization committed to the belief that consciousness, choice, and compassion could matter even in an indifferent universe. The Enterprise continued on its journey, carrying with it the weight of choices made and sacrifices accepted. Behind them, in the spaces between dimensions, a protector kept watch. And in that watching, in that eternal commitment to protection freely chosen, something approaching meaning had been found. Not the meaning imposed by destiny, but the meaning created through choice, through consciousness, and through the simple, profound act of deciding to remain present for those who needed protecting. Live long and prosper. More stories await.